Good evening. I hope your audio. I hope I'm audible and visible along with everybody else on the screen, although I can't see you. My name is Catherine Hellerstein. I'm the director of the Jewish Studies program at Penn and a professor of Yiddish and Jewish American literature in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures. I want to welcome you this evening to the 25th annual Patricia Brown Silvers and David Silvers Visiting Scholar Program hosted by Penn's Jewish Studies program. This year, due to the continuing pandemic, we are holding the Silvers Visiting Scholar Program on Zoom rather than on Penn's campus. We can only hope that next year we will be able to convene again in person. I want to thank Chrissy Walsh, Administrative Coordinator for the Jewish Studies Program, and Chris Pasante in IT in Williams Hall and at Penn for hosting and managing the Zoom format of this talk. A quarter of a century ago, Patty and David Silvers, both alumni of Penn, established the Silvers Visiting Scholar Program in order to bring a distinguished scholar in Jewish studies to the Penn campus each year, specifically in order to interact with students, faculty, and the larger community. We are grateful that the Silvers program can bring to Penn scholars whose work is of distinguished intellectual caliber and contemporary relevance, and that has a significant impact upon current intellectual and social issues in the field of Jewish studies and for the larger Jewish community. I'm especially glad to be able to welcome to this Zoom webinar Patty and David Silvers. I'm really delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Stephen J. Zipperstein, the Daniel E. Koshland Professor in Jewish Culture and History at Stanford University. Professor Zipperstein has also taught in universities in Russia, Poland, France, and Israel, including Oxford University, and has served as director of the Taub Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford. On a personal note, I will say that I've known Steve since we were both students, graduate students in the advanced intermediate Yiddish class at the Uriel Weinreich summer program at YIVO in New York at some point in the latter decades of the 20th century. Stephen Zipperstein is the author and editor of 9 books, including The Jews of Odessa, A Cultural History, which was published in 1986 and won the Smilin Prize for the Outstanding Book in Jewish History. Another book called Elusive Prophet, Achad Ha'am and the Origins of Zionism, which won a National Jewish Book Award. A third book, Imagining Russian Jewry, and a fourth book, Rosenfeld's Lives, Fame, Oblivion, and the Furies of Writing, which was shortlisted for the National Jewish Book Award in Biography, Autobiography, and Memoir. His work has been translated into Russian, Hebrew, and French. And his latest book, Pogrom, Kishinev, and the Tilt of History, published in 2018, was widely reviewed in the most prominent newspapers and magazines throughout the United States and England. Named as one of the best books of 2018 by The Economist, by Haaretz, and the San Francisco Chronicle and Mosaic magazine, it was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in History and the Mark Lytton Award for the Best Nonfiction Book of 2018. Zipperstein has been awarded the Liveright Prize of the Modern Language Association, the Judah Magnus Gold Medal of the American Friends of the Hebrew University, and the Koret Prize for Outstanding Contributions to the American Jewish Community. He's held fellowships at Harvard, Hebrew University, the Yitzhak Rabin Institute in Tel Aviv, and the École des Hautes Études Sciences Sociales, as well as the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York. At Stanford and earlier at Oxford and UCLA, he has supervised the dissertation work of more than 30 students who are now teaching in universities and colleges in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere. Steve Zipperstein has delivered keynote addresses and endowed lectures at several dozen universities in the United States and abroad. His articles have appeared widely in the New York Times Sunday Book Review, the Washington Post, the New Republic, the Jewish Review of Books, Chronicle of Higher Education, the Atlantic, and many scholarly journals. He was an editor of Jewish Social Studies for 20 years and the book series Stanford Studies in Jewish History and Culture for a quarter of a century. He's immediate past chair of the Academic Council of the Center for Jewish History in New York. And together with Anita Shapira, he's series editors of the Yale University Press Leon Black Foundation Jewish Lives volumes that were named in 2015 the best books of the year by the National Jewish Book Council, the first time a book series has won this distinguished prize. Some 45 Jewish Lives books have already appeared, and Zipperstein is currently working on a biography of Philip Roth for the series. In fact, this evening, Steve Zipperstein will speak on this very topic. The title of his topic is On Beginning a Biography of Philip Roth. Before I let him begin his talk on beginning a biography of Philip Roth, I just want to briefly explain the format of this Zoom meeting. Professor Zipperstein will speak for about 45 minutes, after which Benjamin Nathans, professor of history at Penn, will give a brief response. Then our speaker will be happy to entertain questions from the audience for 25 to 30 minutes. When that moment comes, I'll let you know, and I will ask you please to write your questions in the Q&A function on the webinar. It should be at the bottom of your screen. I will select from those questions and read the selected questions aloud. So that's how it's going to go. And for now, please join me virtually in giving a warm welcome to Professor Stephen Zipperstein.
Catherine, thank you for that lovely, long introduction. And I've known Catherine and Ben for a long time. Catherine was too delicate to mention that we studied intermediate Yiddish in the late 70s in New York. What I remember most clearly about the textbook was that it actually had a section about how to order a lube job in Yiddish, written by a rather fervent Yiddishist who believed that there would be some efficacy in actually knowing how to speak to one's car mechanic in Yiddish. What I'll do today is to share with you some insights about the book that I'm now writing, how it came to be, what it promises to look like. I'll speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then open for discussion after Ben Nathan's comments. Let me start here. It seems to me that any book on Philip Roth must foreground the following. It must foreground Roth's voice, a singular, distinctive voice, arguably one of the most distinctive voices in contemporary literature. I'm going to read a paragraph or two from the beginning of The Human Stain. The summer that Coleman took me into his confidence about Fauna Farley and their secret was the summer, fittingly enough, that Bill Clinton's secret emerged in every last mortifying detail, every last lifelike detail, the livingness, like the mortification excluded by the pungency of the specific data. It was a summer in America when the nausea returned, when the joking didn't stop, when the speculation and the theorizing and the hyperbole didn't stop, when the moral obligation to explain to one's children about adult life was abrogated in favor of maintaining in them every illusion about adult life, when the smallness of people was simply crushing, when some kind of demon had been unleashed in the nation, and on both sides, people wondered, why are we so crazy? when men and women alike upon awakening in the morning discovered that during the night in a state of sleep that transported them beyond envy or loathing, they had dreamed of the brazenness of Bill Clinton. I myself dreamed of a mammoth banner draped Dadaistically like a Christo wrapping from one end of the White House to the other and bearing the legend, "A human being lives here." It was a summer when, for the billionth time, the jumble, the mayhem, the mess proved itself more subtle than this one's ideology and that one's morality. It was a summer when a president's penis was on everyone's mind and life in all its shameless impurity once again confounded America. A transition to a book is made of a number of different factors. Those that I'll highlight now are intellectual affinity, opportunity, and urgency. And I'll begin with urgency as a way of explaining how I came to this topic. I came to this topic because I came to Philip Roth at around the age of 17, when I was bound. I was raised as an Orthodox Jew in Los Angeles, a fairly conventional Orthodox home, only unconventional in the sense that my father, a CPA, was a promiscuous book collector. He bought by the pound, and rarely spending more than 50 cents or a dollar on a book. In fact, after he suffered a stroke and I arranged to donate his books to university, we had by then some 30,000 books in a massive transformed garage in the back of our house in LA. I counted 37 copies of Alan Dershowitz's Chutzpah. If you buy books by the pound, you end up with a lot of Alan Dershowitz, apparently. And but it was in that expanded garage that I first read Philip Roth. I was allowed, despite the rather strict Orthodox norms of our house, to subscribe to any magazine that I wanted to, short of the magazines with foldouts. And I had subscriptions to Partisan Review, to the New American Review, and read Whacking Off in the Partisan Review in 1967, just before I left for the Chicago Yeshiva, and remember the impact it had on me as giving me a voice to really speak about freedom. And I'll just one interlude now, just about that expanded library. When I was quite young, maybe 6, 7, I don't remember quite how old, some bohemians, the term was still then used in the late 50s, gave me, for reasons that I can't recall, a Buddha. And they lived around the corner. And I remember carrying the Buddha with great trepidation around to the corner to my home, because I was carrying a pestle, an idol of the sort that Abraham did away with. And remember conferring with my sister, 2 years younger, as to what to do with the pestle, with this idol. And we decided to bury it under a tree. Subsequently, the tree was knocked down. My father's expanded library was built on top of the tree. And I remember distinctly thinking about what it felt like to actually be reading Whacking Off on top of the leveled tree with the Buddha actually underground. And so Philip Roth was someone who gave me a sense of what it might mean to think freely from the earliest age. By the time I started thinking about the possibility of writing this book, I was also building on a long-standing preoccupation with biography. I built biography in one way or another into several of my books, including my latest book, Pogrom, where I see the an event that was, on the one hand, the best documented event in Russian Jewry, and arguably the most misconstrued and most misremembered event in late imperial Russian Jewry. And I build the book in some measure around the first publisher of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Pavel Khrushchev, who was deeply influenced by the pogrom in producing the protocols or helping to produce the protocols. Chaim Nachman Bialik, the great poet, Michael Davitt, an Irish revolutionary who wrote the first best-selling book on Russian Jewry in a Western language. And so biography has long been a preoccupation of mine. And I was given the opportunity to think seriously about this book when I received, and Philip Roth did this with some frequency, he contacted me after an earlier book of mine called Rosenfeld's Lives, Fame, Oblivion, and the Furies of Writing, a book about a now forgotten writer, Isaac Rosenfeld, who came of age with Saul Bellow and was considered at one time the better writer of the two. And it's a study of the interplay between fame and oblivion in literary life, with oblivion being a far more typical fate than Saul Bellows. And I received a note from Philip Roth, who had liked the book. We made contact. He was then in between biographers. We talked for a while about the possibility of my writing his authorized biography. It didn't seem like an attractive idea at the time, but the idea ended up being lodged in my mind about the possibility of actually writing about him. And then once I helped launch the Jewish Lives series and finish my last book, he and I started talking and had several conversations, and he opened up access to close friends of his and others, and I started doing the kind of work that sometimes feels like it lasts forever, and the work that went into the start of this book. There were two particular findings, discoveries that persuaded me that the book was doable, and that there was something really to be told that might otherwise not be told fully by other biographers, and that it was possible to actually write a credible biography about someone who in one way or another had been telling and retelling and not telling the story of his life repeatedly over the course of the last several decades. The first discovery was this. In almost every description of Philip Roth, including many descriptions by him, there's his telling of a heinous, horrible episode that occurred in March 1962, 2 or 3 years after the appearance of his first book, Goodbye Columbus, a collection of a novella and short stories, when he appeared at Yeshiva University, and he was treated terribly, shabbily. The audience hated him. He was called an anti-Semite. He couldn't believe that a people, the Jewish people who had nurtured him in his childhood, would now turn on him so viciously. He described often how sitting with his then wife and an editor in a restaurant, of course, a Jewish restaurant. After the event, he vowed never to write about Jews again, and then he never ceased doing just that. But be that as it may, the event is described in almost every biographical account of him as an event that was horrible. In fact, Salman Rushdie at one point actually compared his own persecution by Iranian authorities to Philip Roth's persecution in that room at Yeshiva University. Probably, if one was to choose, one would probably choose being persecuted by Yeshiva University's students than by the authorities of Iran. But leaving that aside, I managed to discover, and in part, I think because of someone who may be here in this virtual room, Menachem Butler, I managed to discover that a tape of the event existed in the bowels of Yeshiva University. And Roth had threatened a lawsuit if the transcript of the event was released. The tape was hidden away. I told Roth that it existed. He helped me extricate it from Yeshiva University. I have a copy of the tape on the computer that I'm speaking on with you now, and the actual event was completely different from what he remembered. The audience loved him. He at 3 points, at three distinct points during the evening, it's an event where he was invited along with the great African-American novelist Ralph Ellison and an Italian-American writer to speak about the relationship between ethnic identity and artistic conscience. And but it was pretty clear that the organizer of the event, the literature professor at Yeshiva University, had great admiration for Roth, but wanted to persuade him to be rather more responsible as a novelist. At 3 points over the course of the evening, David Fleischer, this literature professor, admits that the audience approves of what Roth is saying immeasurably more than they approve of David Fleischer. Roth brought down the house with a series of jokes. The one that I remember is he quoted from there's a short story in the collection Goodbye Columbus called Epstein that appeared first in a Partisan Review, and it tells of a middle-aged Jewish man who has an affair with a lady across the street, and Roth. And it did cause some controversy. I'll talk about that in a moment. And Roth received a number of angry letters about it. And he quotes from one letter writer in Minneapolis, as I recall, who writes to him and says, is it conceivable that a middle-aged man would actually neglect his business for days on end in order to sleep with a middle-aged woman? And Roth answered, well, yes, it is conceivable. Anyway, what struck me as, now, of course, as an historian and working with archival material, one recognizes that that as often as not, reality, to the extent to which one could actually reconstruct reality. And just as an aside, working with archives as I do and my colleagues do, what all that archives are those papers that happen to fall from a desk that ended up in a file, and that you use in order to try to reconstruct what happened in a room. How many of us have been in rooms with loved ones, with family, where we left the room and everyone in the room had a different recollection of what happened in that room? We as historians are not in those rooms, and yet we dare try to reconstruct what goes on in those rooms. Now, one aspect of one aspect of what actually happened in that room that haunted and that inspired Roth for so long is that I found a document indicating that the event should be advertised in every coffee house in New York City. And so it may well be that the people in that room were not representative of the Orthodox Jews who might have normally gravitated toward an event at Yeshiva University. I don't, in fact, know who was in that room, but I do know that the audience loved him. Afterwards, Roth, as he was leaving the stage, he was accosted by a number of people who were angry. But having spoken at numerous Jewish events over the years, my guess is they could well have been the same people who accost all of us when we actually step off the stage and say something that surprises them. They may actually move from audience to audience over the course of the decades. But by and large, the event was a singular success. As Roth remembered it, the event was devastating, which gave me some sense as to what it is that Roth saw and didn't see as a person, but more importantly, in as much as I'm writing a book fundamentally about a novelist who spent the bulk of his time writing his books, what it says about the perspective he brought to his writing and the way in which he was able to use rage. I mean, the difference, which is fundamental between a neurotic and an artist, is what you do with it. And it's not enough to say, it seems to me, that Roth was beset with all sorts of compulsions and neuroses. To one extent or another, all of us are. There's nothing normal, so to speak, with regard to the lives that so many of us as academics live. There's nothing normal about actually sitting in a room day after day and trying to turn sentences around, which is what most of us who live in the humanities do. That's not the fundamental question to ask, it seems to me, of a writer or an artist. The question is what it is that he or she does with one's bruises. One's bruises exist, and as often as not, one circles around one's bruises, whether one is an artist or not. It's what one does with those bruises that I think is crucial, and it's that interplay between bruise and art that, as I see it, will be at the center of my book. An entree, I think I've gotten into one of the more significant bruises that Roth circled around time and again in his life, was my discovery that his preoccupation with family and the closeness of family, the pervasiveness of family, was one that was to some extent overdetermined, if you will. And what I mean is that I discovered that his family was part of what they described as the best organized Landsmannschaft, family association in the United States. I found a commemorative volume, this one published in 1951, that described how the family Landsmannschaft, the family association that his family was a part of, launched in 1939. It described itself, maybe all Landsmannschaften describe themselves in this way, as the best organized Landsmannschaft in the entire United States. But in contrast to others, their family, which at least the father's side of the family came from the Tarnopol region, just then at the hugging the edge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the family was so proud of their, albeit tenuous, connection with the Austro-Hungarian Empire that when they designed a family crest, they had actually a family crest, which is not typical of Jewish families. The family crest included various aspects from the flag of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This Landsmannschaft, of which Philip Roth's father was elected president for a year-long term in 1943, with his mother Bess as the assistant treasurer. They created their own educational program. They produced a family song. They produced a family newspaper. They had their own stationery. And they saw as a primary goal, at least as of 1951, quote, to train the succeeding generations in the habits and mannerisms of family relationships. This seemed to me all the more fascinating in as much as at the core of so much of Roth's work, starting from the very outset, but certainly evident in his first novel, Letting Go, and from that point on, is that tension between individualism and being enveloped by community. That tension between the freedom of being on one's own and what it means to be enveloped. And it's reminiscent in many ways of a very similar tension at the heart of a writer about whom I just let out my secret, about whom Roth wrote repeatedly, the Russian Jewish writer Isaac Babel, who wrote primarily in the 1920s, to lesser extent in the 1930s. And I've spoke with Roth several times about Babel's impact on him, but it seems to me one key to Roth's fictional imagination is the similarity between the themes that he ended up circling around as a man and as a writer, and those characteristic at the center of Babel's imagination to one of the best examples I could think of with regard to Babel is his short story, The Awakening. Let me just describe it and then connect it with Roth. The story that Babel tells in The Awakening, a semi-autobiographical story, it seems, is of a family in Odessa that had spawned several of the most distinguished violinists of the late 19th century. The boy is 11, 12. The boy's father insists that he become also a distinguished violinist. He gets him a violin teacher named Mr. Zagorsky. The boy has no talent. He skips his lessons and hangs out at the dock. Odessa is a port city. And then they're sitting at the dining room table. Many Jewish stories take place at dining room tables. Maybe other ethnic stories do too. And the boy looks out the window, and then walking down the street toward their house is Mr. Zagorsky. And the boy locks himself into the only place where either in Babel's fiction or in Roth's fiction, one could hope for a semblance of privacy in a thick family house, namely the toilet. He locks himself in the toilet. A few moments later, after Mr. Zagorsky has told the father that the family that the boy has been skipping violin lessons. The entire family is at the bathroom. The father is trying to crash down the door. There's one tiny thing holding the door shut, and the family finally gives up. And this is how the story ends. And I'll bring it back to Roth in a moment. I sat out in my fortress till nightfall, when all had gone to bed, and Bubka took me to my grandmother's. We had a long way to go. The moonlight congealed on bushes unknown to me, on trees that had no name. Some anonymous bird emitted a whistle that was extinguished, perhaps by sleep. What bird was it? What was it called? Does dew fall in the evening? Where's the consolation of the great bear? On what side does the sun rise? We were going along Post Office Street, and Bubka held me firmly by the hand so that I shouldn't run away. She was right. I was thinking of running away. At the core of what Babel writes, and I would argue at the core of what Philip Roth returns to time and again, is that very moment of thinking of running away. You never do. You could lock yourself in the bathroom and do what Portnoy does, and imagine that kind of escape. You could run away to Connecticut or the Berkshires, but you never escape that family hold. You never escape the allure of connection, and at the same time you dream of a life that is unconnected, and at the same time you're never unconnected. And Roth explores just that tension time and time again without any prescription, and a tension that is familiar to all of us. Between my wife and I, we have 5 children and 5 grandchildren. And yet I understand, as I think so many of us do, the way in which human connection both fills us up and depletes us. And Roth will return to just that tension in work after work. The most vivid example of this, and arguably among the most disturbing examples of this in his work, is at the very end of his book, The Dying Animal, where he returns his narrators. Most of his narrators, or a good many of his narrators, are Zuckerman, but the most seductive, unprincipled of all of his narrators is Kepesh, who in one of his novels, one of Roth's novels, actually turns into a breast, and so preoccupied he is with breasts that he actually becomes one. I think he's modeled after the rock critic Albert Goldman, who wrote a piece about Philip Roth soon after the appearance of Goodbye Columbus in 1969, And Albert Goldman ended up being so preoccupied with Roth, and this I discovered in the archives at Columbia, that he kept a log, a Boswell-like log of every meeting he had with Roth in preparation for some kind of book. It goes on, it's hundreds and hundreds of pages of notes and interviews, at least not interviews with Roth, but reminiscences of every conversation he had with Roth in order to try to understand the interplay between inhibition and the desire for freedom in Roth. It's one of the most extraordinary glimpses of Roth's temperament. And again, from the vantage point of someone who is unbelievably narcissistic, unbelievably unpleasant. When he finally dies, Albert Goldman, of a heart attack on an airplane, the story about his death, which may or may not be true, is that he had suffered a heart attack because he was being flown somewhere and he was placed in business class as opposed to first class. And he became so angry about being put in a lesser seat that he actually had a heart attack and died on the airplane before it took off. He's the only person whose obituaries I've ever read where the obit writer said, "Thank God he's dead." In any event, so he may be an imperfect source, and he's the inspiration for Kepesh. But in the very end of Roth's last novel built around David Kepesh, The Dying Animal, it tells of Kepesh, who's a commentator, a book reviewer on NPR, and he teaches one class a year at a place like the New School or NYU. And at the end of every semester, he chooses one gorgeous woman to sleep with, only after he's graded her, so he isn't punished by the university authorities. In this particular instance, there's a Cuban-American woman with extraordinarily beautiful breasts, and they have an affair. His excessive jealousy ruins the affair, and then she comes to him after they're not seeing one another for a couple of years and tells him that she has breast cancer. And at the very end, it's clear that she's going to have a radical mastectomy. And the book ends like this: 10 weeks ago, and the Kepesh person is talking to someone, is unclear to whom. 10 weeks ago, they told her they would remove only a part of it. And now they tell her they're going to remove the whole thing. Mind you, this is a breast, it's not a small thing. This morning, they told her what is going to happen. Now it's night, and she's all alone. And the whole prospect of everything, I have to go. She wants me there. She wants me to sleep in the bed with her there. She has not eaten all day. She has to eat. She has to be fed. You stay if you wish. If you want to stay, if you want, leave. Look, there's no time, I must run. Don't. What? Don't go. But I must. Someone has to be with her. She'll find someone. She's in terror, I'm going. Think about it, think. Because if you go, you're finished. Now, it's a horrible message. It's the kind of message, the kind of lesson that one thinks of in one's worst moments in the middle of the night. And it's not meant to be prescriptive, but it's meant to actually remind the reader of one of the great tensions that people live with, about that interplay between what it means to be alone and what it means to be connected. And Roth probed just that, along with other things, time and time again in his fiction. He's sometimes described as a writer who is fixated on a tiny, tiny number of themes, but as one critic identified the range of themes that Roth wrote about over the course of his many-decade career, they would include, and it seems to me this is a credible list, Jews in America, Israel, Europe, social history of Newark, sex, marriage, aging, the prostate gland, pain, persecution, and disgrace, the political landscape of post-war America, masturbation, death, writing, identity, masquerade, desire, lies, Nixon, racial and sexual politics, childhood, men and women together and apart, and baseball. Not a bad list. Certainly not a small list. What I thought I would do toward the conclusion, since I've said that I'm just beginning this book, and it's a bit of hubris to actually speak about a book just at its very start, what I thought I might do is try out the first 2 paragraphs of the book on you. And these will be rewritten probably numerous times. They'll probably be obliterated. I'll probably forget about them. But just to give you a sense of how I imagine the book beginning, and also to highlight how, as I see it in a book about Roth, what one focuses on and what one should focus on is what it is he did at his writing desk. Roth did other things too, and there'll be other biographies. One has just appeared in March by Ira Nadel. Another one by Blake Bailey, the authorized biography, will appear very soon in April. But it seems to me that to the extent to which one actually focuses on why it is one writes a book about Roth, what one must center in such a book is what it is he does at his writing desk, which is the activity that he engages in for about 90% of his time. To be sure, another at least 8%, including sleeping, involves interaction with numerous women, and all of that must be part of his biography. Often messy relationships with women, certainly unsuccessful, unhappy relationships with his two wives. Part of what literary biography does is it actually shows us what it is that an artist does against the backdrop of an often extraordinarily messy life. Think of the lives of Virginia Woolf. Think of the life of Dostoevsky. And Roth's life was in many respects messy, as he wrote about in one way or another with the use of his fictional narrators time and time again. And at the same time, he was able to produce, it seems to me, in many instances, extraordinary beauty. Hence, I begin my book, well, I think I begin my book. I probably won't begin my book in the following way. Tom Paine burst into Benjamin Franklin's London home, insolent, unkempt, a mid-20th century pent-up adolescent in the guise of a late 18th century English farm boy, where he manages in Howard Fast's widely read 1943 historical novel, Citizen Tom Paine, to charm a bemused Franklin, much as he will the 13 or 14-year-old Philip Roth, who would identify this as quite possibly the first real book he'd ever read. Paine here is belligerent with, quote, inside of him, something burning uneasily, end quote. He introduces himself as a working man, someone who has bounced about doing odd jobs, not all that well, desperate to flee class-ridden, rotten England for the openness, the promise of America. A benevolent Franklin would insist him to do just that, setting him on a course where he would emerge as a writer, celebrated, accursed, forever indispensable, seeking to capture on the page, in the words of Howard Fast Paine, quote, what a man can't because he's got no guts in him to say it. Over the course of perhaps the most fabled American writing career of the last half century, Philip Roth would come to see himself in much the same way. Thank you.
So now Ben Nathans will give a response.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Steve. By way of prefatory remark, I want to say I've seen Steve give numerous talks in numerous venues over the last couple of decades, and I always feel grateful to be in the room. There is no room this time, but you can imagine being in the room and experiencing what for me is the writerly voice of Steve Zipperstein. And it's a special pleasure to be able to kick off the Q&A in this session. I should say that Steve was my informal mentor when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, and he had just arrived as an assistant professor at Stanford. And even though I wasn't in his particular stable, he showed tremendous generosity and insight in helping guide my first steps as an historian. I want to talk a little bit about the long arc, not of Philip Roth's career, but of Steve Zipperstein's career, because it's an unusual arc. This is someone who has produced multiple books on two rather distinct subjects. One of them, I dare say, for which he's most known, and that is the history of Russian Jewry in the imperial period, the 19th and early 20th centuries. But the other is as an acute reader and student of American Jewish writers, first with Isaac Rosenfeld and now with Philip Roth. It's true that both of those writers are separated from Russian Jewry by only 2 generations in Roth's case and 1 in Rosenfeld's. But it doesn't seem to me that there's an obvious connection in Steve's case between these 2 sections of his intellectual universe. And one of the first things I'd like to hear you talk about, Steve, if you're willing, is how do these 2 parts fit together? Or are they in fact separate? Is there a tension between them, or is there some kind of organic connection that has led you to oscillate back and forth between these 2 scenes, Russian Jewry on the one hand and mid-late century, 20th century American Jewish writers on the other? Let me go back to that story about Roth's appearance at Yeshiva University in 1962. You told us about discovering the existence of what I assume was an audio tape of that evening's session and how radically different it was from the account of it that you had gotten from Roth, and not only you, but many people had gotten from Roth. It struck me that, and I'd like you to correct me if I'm wrong, but it struck me that this was the moment, or one of the moments perhaps, that every biographer looks for when you have found the Archimedean point to stand on that liberates you from Roth's own interpretation of his life. And it gives you a little bit of distance, leveraged by this, let's just call it a primary source that you unearthed from the archives of Yeshiva University. Does it work that way for you? Do you feel like you have been able to step outside the fragments of autobiography that make their way into Roth's fiction, and they are thick and ubiquitous all over his novels? Have you been able to step outside of that? And do you see that as one of the necessary moves to achieving intellectual independence as a biographer? Or are you finding that Roth himself was aware of the difference between history and memory in his case, made his own use of it? And this is not your Archimedean point, and I've misconstrued the significance of that episode. It struck me, though, that you highlighted it in a way that suggested that for you, it was quite significant to have uncovered that gap between what he remembers and, to the best that we can know, what actually happened that night. Now, my instructions are to keep these remarks brief, and I do want to honor that because we have a large audience here, and I know that there'll be questions coming in the Q&A. But there are a couple of other issues that I just want to raise, and these are, in essence, my own questions for Steve to respond to or not as he sees fit, along with all of the other ones that will come in. But one of the things that has really intrigued me about Roth among American Jewish writers is the depth and longevity of his interest in Israel. This is not a milieu that was native for him. This was not a case of a writer writing what he knows. This was at best acquired knowledge, and yet it takes a place in his fiction that is in some ways marks him apart from almost every other major American Jewish writer that I can think of. They did what writers are supposed to do. They wrote about what they knew. They wrote about the milieus in which they had grown up and that they knew from the inside on a sensory level. Maybe this is too far along in the projects for you to have dealt with yet. You have a modest title for tonight's talk about beginning the autobiography, but I can't help but assume that you've thought about this, and in some way it was part of what made Roth interesting to you. And finally, you managed to mine a tremendous amount of insight from this tension, as you described it, between Roth's quest for individual autonomy and his lifelong sense of being, as you put it, enveloped by family and community. And you cast this as the kind of the creative tension out of which so much of his work emerged. You don't have to be a Roth scholar or even to be intimately familiar with much of Roth's work to know that that tension, that journey was flavored masculine from start to finish. And I'm just curious, how much of that is Roth searching for his masculine self, his manhood? How much does he want it to be read as a human quest for some kind of balance between autonomy and connectedness with others? So I've taken a little bit more than my allotted 5 minutes, but I thought I would just put those out on the table, and thank you again for the pleasure of the hour of listening to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ben. Let me try to respond briefly to the questions, and then we'll open up for discussion. The first question about the interplay between books on Russian Jewry and American cultural life is really a kind of a personal question, but I'm not shying away from it. And I think what unites all of my work really is what it means to live with books. Books helped me understand how to speak coherently about the world. And really, at the outset, the books that I discovered in my father's library. Inasmuch as he bought books by the pound, he also bought books with the word sex in them, usually books like Ann Landers talks about sex, rather benign books. But whenever there was a book with the word sex in it, he would turn the spine around. And so on Shabbos afternoon, when my father, like many Orthodox Jews, would be sleeping, I would actually wander through the library and turn all the bindings around when I was a teenager. And so even discovering about sexuality, I didn't discover, if you will, often goss on the street, but in my father's library. Books were how I learned how to deal with the world, how to understand how to move from one world to another world, which was a very painful process at the time in my late teens and early 20s. And so I think as a writer and a scholar, and I in some ways I stumbled into scholarship. I entered graduate school not because I was thinking about a career. This was in the early 70s when rent was cheap. And I don't think I knew anyone as an undergraduate who used the word career. There were those people across campus, perhaps in the engineering school, who did, but I didn't really know them. I knew that graduate school was a place where people read and wrote, and I'd like to read and I'd like to write. And so consequently, I went to graduate school, and what I liked to read the most was history. And so I entered graduate school in history without really thinking about what that might mean. And in many ways, eschewed utilitarian decisions. When I decided to write my dissertation on Odessa, on the cultural history of the Jews of Odessa, it made no sense at all because I had no access to archives and was not even permitted to visit Odessa. But it would have been made much more sense to write about Vilna. And as much as I had moved to New York and I was sitting at the Evo Library, I had a fellowship that allowed me to carry my money from University of California. Writing about Vilna would have been a logical choice, but I didn't want to write about Vilna. I wanted to write about Odessa, and I wanted to write about what I wanted to write about. And so I think and whenever I've finished something, and as you know, you live with something for a long time, we live with our books for many years, and then if they're successful in any way, you live with them long after they're finished. I pretty much turned to something else. And so there was nothing intentional about turning from Russia to America. I came to Isaac Rosenfeld partly because of his preoccupation with Russia, and then stayed with him because I discovered all sorts of previously unpublished manuscripts and letters, and I was fascinated in his case by what actually what it means, with the way in which books could help open up the world for you, and the way in which books help you hide. And I think I learned a great deal about the use of books as a source of enlightenment and opening the world, and the use of books as a way of hiding from the world as I came of age in the yeshiva world and remained preoccupied with these kinds of questions. And so I think it was a cluster of a medley of questions, if you will, the term that I used with regard to Roth, bruises, that I just ended up circling around time and again with different geographical focus. Hopefully that responds to your first question. It's not that I feel that the discovery of the Yeshiva University tape and Roth's understanding of it, and what Roth took away from the responses of Jewish authorities to his work, tells me something objective about him. What it tells me is about the depth of rage in Roth's own temperament, and the way in which he uses rage in his work. He was praised by all sorts of figures. Joachim Prinz, the well-known rabbi in Newark, took him under his wing. He was compared to Martin Buber by Eugene Borowitz, and all that he forgot. And what he remembered was Emanuel Rachman, later the provost of Yeshiva University, who was actually one of the more liberal voices within Orthodoxy, and he turned Emanuel Rachman into someone akin to one of the dictators of Iran. And Emanuel Rachman, devoted to a liberalizing Orthodoxy, was particularly bruised by his treatment of Jews in his fictional work. In one of his essays, he devotes probably no fewer than 8 pages attacking Emanuel Rachman, where it could have sufficed by just limiting it to 2.5 pages. And so it was the role of rage that fascinated me, and that seemed to serve as a key to understanding his fictional imagination. And that's what I took away above all from the Yeshiva University discovery. And the relationship to Israel, it is, I think, akin to his relationship to Prague. And it's born out of a sense of Jewish kinship, but as he often said, what interests him are people in trouble. And if you're interested in Jews and you're interested in people in trouble, you buy a ticket to Tel Aviv. And so he didn't come to a preoccupation with Israel like, say, Hugh Nissenson or the few American Jewish writers who actually have done important fictional work around Israel. He came to preoccupation with Israel because their problems were, as you say in Hebrew, bolet. They were simply so apparent and obvious and overflowing, and hence his masterpiece, The Counterlife, and his controversial masterpiece, some see it, Operation Sharlock. And so yes, he does stand out among American Jewish writers. And the masculinity. Yes, I mean, as he called one of his perhaps less successful novels, what Roth writes about time and again is My Life as a Man. And there are some extraordinary fictional portrayals, and we might talk about that during the discussion period soon. And among Roth's closest friends, most of the people who spoke at his funeral that I attended at Bard were women, among them women of extraordinary talent. But by and large, his fiction is devoted to the lives of men. And to the extent to which one could continue to write about the lives of men, his literature remains pertinent. And so that's how I would begin to answer that last question. Okay, do we open it up?
Sure.
And thank you, Ben. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, for a beautiful response, and Stephen for a beautiful response to the response, and for a great
Okay,
talk.
We'll try to sustain this beauty now for the next half hour.
May we do so. So there are some questions on the Q&A, and I will voice them one by one. So Benjamin Schreier asks, you began by making appropriate reference, to be sure, to Roth's magisterial voice. I've never written biography, and am, to be honest, not particularly attracted to the genre for the purposes of the kind of scholarship that stimulates me. But I'm wondering how you are thinking about negotiating the tension between Roth's voice and your own, given that any biography worth reading must express its author's voice.
First, Benjamin, hello, and I know Benjamin. I know his work, and I know that he's not particularly attracted to biography. I wish we could be in conversation now, Ben. So my voice and his voice, and I have to be acutely aware that the book is first and foremost about his voice, and it's told, however, in my voice. And as you know, Benjamin, there'll be a number of biographical treatments of him coming out, and mine will be one of several. And much as there have been numerous biographies of Dickens and Faulkner, and they come out almost annually, there'll be, I suspect, a good many biographical treatments of Roth. How do I negotiate the tension or the interplay, let's not use the word tension, between my voice and Roth's voice? I tried to provide an example in the two paragraphs that I read, and in that I'm putting at the epicenter of my book a study of his voice and of his writerly life, because I think that's the reason why one actually writes a book about a writer. And I mean, I could circle around your question, and your question is wonderful, but I'm not sure that I could actually answer your question with any accuracy before I do more of my writing. And so what if we agreed to do this, Benjamin? So at some point in the next year or two, once I do more of my writing, I will answer your question either in person or by email. And why don't we just move on from there? And I promise not to avoid every other question that's asked. It's a very hard question to answer. I can't say that at this stage in my writing, my last book, Pogrom, I would have known how to answer that particular question. And it's all in the doing, and it's all in the writing and rewriting. And I go through many drafts. And I found with my last book, Pogrom, I ended up asking myself, in as much as I wanted it was a book in many ways about the construction of contemporary Jewish consciousness. And I wanted it to be a book that could be read at one and the same time by my scholarly peers and by a larger reading audience. And so I interrogated literally every sentence and asked myself, with regard to every sentence, whether what I was saying was necessary or not. And I ended up cutting a great deal. And one ends up knowing as a writer whether one gravitates toward being concise or being less than concise. I've come to be close friends with one of Ben's professors, Yuri Gessen, and Yuri gravitates toward Tolstoy, and I gravitate toward Chekhov. And so I prefer to be briefer than Yuri. And I think what he does is masterful. And I try to do it as well as I possibly can. So it's a question that I think can't be answered at this point in the writing. Catherine, just field some easier questions, okay?
Yeah, sure. Sonia Michelle asks, how did Roth respond to feminist critiques of his portrayals of women, especially Sophie Portnoy, but others as well?
You know, there wasn't all that much criticism of Sophie Portnoy at the time when Portnoy's complaint came out in 1969 from feminist circles. And actually, it was praised by some of the same critics who would excoriate him a few years later, like Vivian Gornick. And he ended up being attacked by critics influenced by feminism, especially after the publication of My Life as a Man in 1973, where there's a description of a violent episode between him and his and the character's wife, who's modeled after Roth's first wife. How did Roth respond? Roth responded or insisted that he responded with complete indifference. My sense of Roth is that he never responded to criticism with indifference, but he insisted that he responded with indifference, and of course wrote about the most extreme examples of feminist criticism extensively in a book like The Human Stain, and what he would argue is that in books like When She Was Good, in his portrayal of Drenka in Sabbath's Theater, he wrote extraordinary portraits, very full portraits of women. And I think that is accurate. At the same time, to the extent to which his fictional imagination was animated, as I suggested earlier, it was animated first and foremost by his life as a man. And which he was deeply unsettled, despite his disavowal by charges of misogyny, and convinced that the call from Stockholm never came because of accusations of that sort. He was a man with extraordinarily strong feelings, and who would express these feelings in the form of stereotypes, at least to those closest to him. In his letters early on, there's their characterizations of homosexuals that when read today are unsettling. And he, but at the same time, he was deeply influenced by stand-up comedians, and some of the figures who either influenced him or he brushed up against, like Lenny Bruce, spoke in not dissimilar terms. And So
here's a question. I don't know if you're going to want to answer it.
Do I seem skittish about questions?
No.
I agree to
Amy,
answer this one.
Yeah, Amy Peth, or I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. What do you think of the Bailey biography and Joshua Cohn's review of it that responded in Philip Roth's own voice in a review called Philip Roth Reviews His Own Biographer?
Right, in Harper's. What makes you think I don't want to respond to that?
Oh, I don't know.
I
can't read your mind.
Yeah. I mean, Joshua Cohen is a very interesting novelist. And of course, if embedded in that review where he actually reviews. It's Philip Roth, I believe in Hell, who has just read Blake Bailey's biography, which is still in the form of Galleys, and which will be coming out in April. And so Roth has gotten a hold of the Galleys and has read it and has decided to review it in Harper's. And in the midst of the review, Roth says, well, it seems to me a far better biographer would be someone, and then there's an entire paragraph describing Joshua Cohen. And so it's clever on a number of levels. And I'm not going to weigh in as to whether I agree with it or not. And I've just finished reading Blake Bailey's 880-page biography in Galleys, and it's a work of tireless, assiduous energy, and so I can certainly say that I don't really feel comfortable commenting on the book until it's out, and probably only then in the context of my own biography. I'm not going to avoid every question.
I don't think you'll avoid questions. Eric Alterman asks, to what degree do you think Roth's public image as a monkish writer was accurate or inaccurate, and how important was this image to him to maintain?
Eric, good to hear from you. Yeah, it's both a conceit as I see it. It's as accurate as it is inaccurate. He lives a very active life, and not only active in one sense of the term. He's an extremely convivial person. He describes how, in many ways, the voice that he uses in Portnoy's complaint, he practices with friends, starting in the mid 60s. Even when he retreats to Yaddo, there are writers with whom he becomes very close with. Alison Lurie, actually, who writes a novel about Yaddo. I can look at it from across my study. I can't remember the title at the moment. Actually, in his early draft, has a Rothian character that she eventually excises, and who's interacting actively, if also acerbically, with all the people at Yaddo. He, at the same time, as I suggested earlier, there is this interplay deep inside of Roth between protecting himself from being inundated by relationships, inundated by love, inundated by family, and a very active, very real conviviality. And hence, I think the move between New York City and Connecticut that his characters describe in his books, and that he himself experienced. This notion of him as a recluse who refuses to be interviewed, I think, was a conceit that he took on. He conducted, as you know, Eric, many interviews, and he chose to reveal what he chose to reveal, and he chose to conceal what he wanted to conceal. I feel strongly as a biographer that there's something fundamentally intrusive about the entire enterprise of biography, and no biographer has the right to know someone's secrets. One has a right to keep one's secrets secret. And it's if one could actually have access to the messiness of a person's life, to be able to understand how an artist like Roth manages to construct what he does against the backdrop of the rest of life, one can construct a really good biography potentially. But one doesn't have an intrinsic right to do that. And Roth had every reason to protect his privacy. He knew how to protect it when he wanted to, and he knew how to be revealing when he was revealing. And he was very strategic. with regard to speaking out whenever he wanted to speak out, and did so with real frequency. And so this monkish notion of Roth was something of a construction. And as many literary constructions, it had some reflection, it had some semblance of reality to it.
So, of course, as the time is passing by, the questions are suddenly pouring in. So I'm going to ask about 3 more questions. Well, let's see how much time it takes. But Beth Wenger has a question. Where did it go now? Could you say something about Roth's American political worldview? The Plot Against America reveals the insecurity of the American liberal state so vividly and presciently for our time. I wonder if you would elaborate on how his political outlook evolved.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think The Plot Against America is one of his strongest books. I mean, it's a book that had great resonance for obvious reasons, partly because of the second George Bush, and then because of what it is all of us endured the last 4 years. And it did seem suddenly prescient, and especially during the years of Trump. His politics did both evolve and not evolve. It's a really interesting question, Beth. He was always someone on the liberal left, but the very term liberal left itself has evolved, as all of us know. And he, to the extent to which he was ever active politically, it was during the Vietnam War. He found Nixon abhorrent. Of course, eventually he found Trump abhorrent. He insisted that The Plot Against America was not inspired by the second George Bush, and was written, obviously, and published long before Trump. But he always, and I think this remained consistent during his more politically active years, as well as later, he came of age as a patriotic American at a time when one could feel that figures like Eleanor Roosevelt represented what it meant, and certainly her husband, to be a patriotic American at a time when, as the character played by Barbra Streisand in The Way We Were, could have posters on her wall, both of Stalin and of FDR, and that both were representative of a patriotic American at a time when members of the Communist Party would, of course, have pictures of Abraham Lincoln on their wall, when the Women's Jewish Communist Organization was called the Emma Lazarus Club. And so he came of age in that America, and as a kind of PR reading, certainly left of center patriotic American, and at a time, as he saw it, that there was no conflict at all between being a patriotic American and being a Jew, and one didn't have to think much about one or the other, because both came simply naturally to you. He becomes more and more preoccupied with telling the story of America in what he ends up calling his American trilogy, which some feel are his strongest books. I don't know that all of the 3 are his greatest books, but a book like The Human Stain, I think, is certainly one of his masterpieces. And he decides, after the equivocal response to Operation Shylock, to try to unpack the crucial moments in the American saga, at least in the American saga that he had lived through, and hence does that in American Pastoral and Human Stain. And and in many ways the rest of the books that he publishes over the course of his life. I don't know that his politics change. He decides that to the extent to which he might be able to be most useful and spend his time most usefully, it's not engaged in activist politics, but in writing. At the same time, he's someone who devotes huge amount of energy in the 70s and 80s to that extraordinary series of writers from another Europe. And he solicits the introductions to the books. He negotiates the contract with Penguin. He basically opens up a self-made publishing house in order to give voice to numerous writers from East Central Europe and elsewhere who otherwise wouldn't exist in the English-speaking world. Probably that's his most sustained activist engagement in his life. He, I think, probably remains an extraordinarily proud American in the guise of an America where represented by FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt. That I think is as precise as I can be.
Michael Kimmage asks, I have no doubt that your book will be wonderful literary history. Will it also be, like much of your other work, intellectual history? I ask because Roth was a man of ideas, but never really a novelist of ideas. He was exceptionally well read, but not necessarily enamored of ideas, still less of theories of one kind or another.
Yeah, it's either major American Jewish historians or literary historians, one after another. Michael, it's good to hear from you. Michael wrote an extraordinary book on Philip Roth's American trilogy. He's not a novelist of ideas, but he actually is interested in ideas in ways not dissimilar from the way in which many historians are interested in ideas. He's interested in the way in which ideas imprint themselves, the way in which life imprints itself in concrete ways. His fictional imagination is actually not dissimilar from the way in which historians work, in that we try to actually, as best as possible, as I sought to describe before, describe what happens in a room. And with the use of whatever material we have on hand, we use archival material and printed material. Roth, who was an assiduous reader, used comparable material and then is able to use his imagination in ways that we're cautioned against. It's his writerly imagination that interests me above all. Is the way in which he negotiates, as I suggested earlier, between the often extraordinary messiness of his life, his not infrequently rageful life, rage that continues well into old age, as is demonstrated by the various memos that he writes in old age about his life to Blake Bailey, many of which I've been able to read, how he negotiates between that and the pristine, extraordinary beauty on the page. Now, one could call that intellectual biography, one could call that literary biography. It seems to me that's the only credible way that I know how to interrogate Roth. And so his preoccupation with the concrete is something that draws me to him, that has always drawn me to material as an historian, and that draws me to his fiction as well. And so I don't necessarily anticipate the tension, but of course I'm just in the middle of writing, and writing is replete with tension. So, but it's an interesting, very interesting question.
There are many other questions and we have 4 minutes left. So there are two options. I could pick one more question, or I could read or summarize very quickly the questions and you can give you the last word.
Why don't you just give me all the questions, maybe indicate who the questioners are.
Yeah, I will, definitely. Let me just find where I am in my list here. Josh King, under the guise of his mother's computer, I guess, Andrea Scharf, says, wonderful talk.
It's Joshua Krug. I want you to be
Oh,
able to ask me a question from someone I don't know. So
okay.
yes, but go on.
Is it? Let's see. Oh, Krug. Well, I clearly need new glasses. Sorry, Josh. What or who do you think Roth would be writing about in these times? That's another question. Miura Chang asks, do you think Roth considered himself to be a secular prophet and counter voice to Jewish religious voices of his time? Is that's why he was so full of rage and hostility to the religious establishment? Grisha Frieden, probably reading your name wrong too, asks, how do you define a writer's voice so central to your project? It's a trope, of course, but what do you mean by it? Michael Nutkowitz asks, in writing his biography, what's the relative weight you give between the autobiographical material Roth shares in the novels and the more objective material that you're culling from interviews and letters? Robert
So
Cohn.
why don't you just end there just for a moment? Grisha, who's one of the great living Bible scholars, perhaps the greatest, lives just up the hill from me, and I promise to have a conversation with you about about the question that you ask. The question about rage. It's not exclusively a rage directed at rabbis. It's a Roth's he often rages against being misunderstood. Probably this offers some clue as to why his marriages don't work, and the first woman he's married to, he describes repeatedly in novels as being somewhat deranged. It may have been accurate. Letters written at the time, both by him and her, suggest otherwise, but of course, letters themselves are performative, and so what one learns from letters can be rather limited. And he's not raging at religion because he is by and large indifferent to religion. And so religion isn't the source of inhibition for Roth, not as a child and not later on. And he's raging at the outset, as he sees it after he publishes Portnoy's complaint, against ridiculous literary inhibition. He's really the first major American Jewish writer to write about a post-World War American Jewry that is in many ways post-immigration, post-Yiddish, not even preoccupied with Yiddish, increasingly suburban. That's one of the keys to Goodbye Columbus. He manages to capture the cadence of this community remarkably well. Even critics of his who write in complaining about one of his stories at the New Yorker, I've gone through the archives, says that you manage to mimic us so well, and that's what I hold against you, that you do it so well. And the rage, he insists, contrary to all evidence, that that in essentially all the relationships he has with women, he's not at fault. And I could never say that. Perhaps Ben would be able to say that about his life, but I can't say that about mine. And Roth insists that to be true of his. And so the rage is not exclusively directed at religious authority. Do you have another couple of questions before we end?
Let me spout them out. Robert Cohn asks, significance of my life as a man, parallel to Miller's After the Fall, to Bob Cohen, St. Louis Jewish Light. Miriam Shaw asks, in what ways do your biography projects of Rosenfeld and Roth differ for you? How have these projects affected you differently on a personal, intimate level? What is it like writing about someone who's virtually unknown and someone about whom so much has already been said? And Arthur Kirone asks you, please say more about Roth's rage, which you just have. Did he use words as weapons? Does he bear any responsibility for pain he caused?
Does he bear any responsibility for the pain that he caused? I wish Arthur could say more about that, as Roth would rephrase his question perhaps is, do those who've caused me such pain bear any responsibility for the pain that they've caused? That's how he might rephrase that question with regard to Claire Bloom and her memoir. Not entirely, but largely built around their marriage. And he does write about those that he knows, but that's what a novelist does. And writing about those that he knows and writing as vividly and effectively about those that he knows does cause pain. And that certainly does occur. But from the outset, he decides, and this is how he settles on writing the stories in Goodbye Columbus, he decides that where he's best is writing about what he knows. And the story, I'm not sure to what extent this is accurate or not. And of course, how you write accurately about someone who is telling stories about the very person you're writing about is one of the great challenges of writing a biography of someone like Roth. In trying to address Arthur's question, the story he told was that years after publishing Goodbye Columbus, which was built around the story of a romance that he had with a woman still very much alive and with whom I've spoken often on the phone. And her sister, he was at a lecture at the Y of Abba Eben's, who was then a singular force in Israeli politics calling for open negotiation with Yasser Arafat. And at the end of the program, this woman's sister came up to Philip Roth and started yelling at him, according to his rendition, and said to him, "You with the writing of Goodbye Columbus, you hurt my family terribly, and I could never forgive you." And Roth, as he described it, turns to her and says, "You could forgive Yasser, you could forgive Yasser Arafat, but you can't forgive me." And now the woman who is the model for Brenda Potemkin insists, and here we get to the conundrum of writing about biography, is that Roth never said that to the sister, but he thought that was a great line, and then he eventually related the incident with the line about Abba Eban and Yasser Arafat. And so what all that adds up to is that I have quite a task in front of me. And Catherine, Ben, all of you, it's been a great pleasure being with you at Penn. And any questions I didn't answer, just people feel free to email me, and I promise to respond.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you, Ben, for your response. But Steve, thank you for an inspiring talk, and I wish you all the best and lots of ruthlessness in your own writing of this amazing biography to be. Thank you, and thank you to the unseen audience for attending.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.